Okay, so we are back. We have been gone for quite a long time. So we wanted to kick off this video. I believe this video is going to be relevant, not just for our culture and where our culture is, and also with last month being Pastor Appreciation Month, but then also just with where we've been. So we actually kind of put Anchor and Abide on the back burner. And then eventually we kind of just took it off the stove completely. The reason for that was that we were really in a really difficult season personally. Our marriage remained strong in that time, and that was by God's grace. But personally, especially me, I was in a very dark season, a very dark valley. I guess the ancients would call it what would they call it, baby?
The dark night of the soul.
The dark night of the soul. Yeah, I was in one of those, and I was in one of those even whenever we kind of started the YouTube channel, and then it just kept getting darker and darker.
So for a Christian, something that's characteristic of a dark night is spiritual dryness, feeling like God's just really distant, or feeling like your prayers just kind of bouncing off the ceiling, just feeling like you're surrounded by darkness, like you're just very disconnected from the Lord. That's one of the key indicators that you're experiencing a dark night of the soul.
So that's why we stepped out of the YouTube channel game for a little bit. But here's why we're stepping back in. There's a few reasons. I guess the biggest reason is that we definitely felt whenever we started it, almost a year ago, we definitely felt as though it was something that Father was wanting us to do, was leading us to do, and we still feel that way. The second reason is because we are beginning kind of a new adventure together that we are excited about sharing, and we want to share that, and we feel like YouTube is a very good platform to share that, to share this journey that we're going to be going on, and we're going to share more about that later. But then also the third reason, that journey that we're going on requires us to be raising support. So YouTube is a good platform to do that. One, two, YouTube is a really good way to inform supporters that we already have of what we're doing and what's going on, where we are, what we're thinking, who it is that they're supporting, getting to know us a little bit better. So that's why we're picking it back up. So we're picking it back up with this first video talking about depression, specifically depression amongst pastors, because I was a pastor dealing with depression, dealing with this dark night, and it got insanely dark. I don't know how raw we want to go, but we're probably not going to go too raw. But there was definitely some suicidal struggles there. During that time, I really leaned on some peers of mine and some mentors that I was just regularly confessing really everything to. Crystal had their numbers. There was at least one time where she called a friend and just said, "You just need to come hang out with Kingston." And that friend dropped everything he was doing. And we literally hung out the entire day. And I really needed that. There was another friend that he could just see that I was not right. I wasn't really even sharing things with him, but I did because he just kind of sensed that something was off and invited me to hang out with him. And I just told him what I was wrestling with, even though I didn't even really know what I was wrestling with. But just given like I said, last month was Pastor Appreciation Month. October was a Pastor Appreciation Month, and there's been some real tragedies in the church with pastors deciding that suicide is the option for them, and I can relate very much so to that struggle. By God's grace, that didn't happen, and we're of course remarkably grateful for that. But I just wanted to share a little bit about my personal experience in this. One, to maybe encourage some pastors out there who might be struggling with some similar things, but then also if you're in the church and you're not a pastor, then that means that you have a pastor, right? And I just want you to be aware of some things that your pastor may be struggling with. And we're going to talk about really what it is that you can do for your pastor.
Sometimes in the church, we treat depression or mental illness as a sin issue, as something that is shameful, and the remedy is just reading your Bible more, or spending more time in prayer, or not skipping out on the Wednesday night Bible study. And I think that's amplified when it's a pastor that is struggling with depression, or wrestling with suicide, or loses their life to suicide. And it's really a failure of the Church Universal. I think that we need to talk more openly about depression, and talk more openly about suicide, because I think it's such a weapon of the enemy. We don't talk an awful lot about spiritual warfare, because it is so I know it's more of an uncomfortable conversation.
It's abstract.
Yeah, it's very abstract. And so, but it's a huge reality in ministry. And if you're somebody who's never experienced something that you could definitely say was spiritual warfare, and then you get into ministry, then that will more than likely change. And I think effective ministry, there is probably always, I would say, a dynamic of spiritual warfare. And the enemy, the devil comes to steal, kill, and destroy, right? So I think that's one of his main weapons is depression. There's different causes of depression, so I don't mean to speak generally of depression, of someone struggling with clinical depression or something like that. I'm speaking personally, even though I'm not a pastor that has experienced depression. I've always struggled with depression in my life. Just as long as I can remember, it's been a reality for me. And personally, it's been a difficulty in my spiritual life and in my walk, because I always felt like, God promises us joy and peace and a sound mind. And it was kind of like, Lord, I've been walking this thing out. I was baptized when I was 7. I've been following you, not faithfully the whole time, but as of late, very faithfully. And, even living our lives in ministry now, and sacrificing a lot to do his work. And especially through my pregnancies, I've dealt with postpartum depression, as well as I guess postpartum like OCD, just like really paranoid anxiety and stuff like that. So I've never described myself as having a sound mind. But for me, I feel like God has used depression so that to sanctify me, like you said earlier, to bring me to a point where I'm not worshiping him for his fruit, for the benefits, which are still promises of his, and are still promises that I have, but just because he is. Yeah. Just because he is. And it really, like you said, it is freeing to, it opens me up to receive his love more and to give his love more to others. Just loving him and worshiping him because he is. My spiritual life is less of a roller coaster, and it's not so conditional upon what my hormones are doing, or how much sleep I got the night before, and things of that nature. So God allows us to go through these seasons, whether for some it's a season, it's spiritual, for some it's clinical or hormonal or whatever it may be. But God allows this so that we can experience him more, and it brings a level of peace and joy that is deeper than what I was even searching for my whole life from him.
So here's our story. Here's my story in this. I experienced a couple of years ago, after we had one of the biggest fights we'd ever had. I went on this incredible journey with the scriptures to really diagnose why it was that I was why I was really leaning so much on my sin tendencies, on my sin and on my flesh. Why was I leaning so much on that? Because I knew the gospel, and I just dove into the scriptures with whatever bad intent I had. I mean, that's what we've talked about in spiritual formation. Spiritual formation is just approaching the Father with your weak self and admitting that I'm weak. This is all I have. All I have is my obligation to approach you. Can you do something with that? Or all I have is a desire to approach you, but really the desire is not even there. Can you do something with that? And I did. I was in that state of obligation, and so I approached Father in prayer and through Scripture. And over the course of a couple of weeks, it really didn't take long. He just started to really blow up in my life. I mean, and I went on this spiritual high, this spiritual mountaintop like I'd never been on before. And then I was in ministry in the context of ministry, that a certain person really spoke into a lot of insecurities, which happens whenever you're in ministry. It can be done with really good intent, where somebody's just seeing an issue and they want to talk to their pastor about it. There's nothing wrong with that. It can also be done with really bad intent, where the person is just being hot-headed and being very selfish, but still speaking into insecurities in the pastor that maybe they don't even know they're doing. And that happened to me. Somebody just really spoke into some insecurities with me, and it sent me from that mountaintop on this downward spiral. I didn't even know how I got there, what I was struggling with, what was going on. But really what it boiled down to me was an identity issue. And really that's what I'm gonna say is the issue for everybody that is struggling with that dark night of the soul, is an identity issue. Father puts us in those dark nights so that we can wrestle with our identity in Him. And so that we can come through on the other end with a greater understanding of our identity in Him. And that was definitely the case for me. I'll give you some examples of what happened in that dark night. Some things that I was feeling. I just felt like nothing was right. Nothing was okay. Nothing was okay in the ministry. Nothing was okay in our family. Just nothing was right. And Crystal, I would be complaining and I would be grumbling, and Crystal would say, I don't know why you're so upset, because everything seems to be going really well. I mean, we had just launched a small group ministry, for example, that was doing remarkably well. The majority of the church was involved in these small groups, and that was awesome. And not only were they involved, they were talking about how the small groups were really helping them personally and helping them in community. I mean, there were really awesome things going on in our family, and I just was not seeing it. And I would be complaining about people at church, and I would just kind of say, well, people at church, and Crystal would say, but what people, right? Because everybody, yeah, like who are you talking about? And I really couldn't name one person. So it was always just it was really weird, but I so felt it to be true. This darkness just consumed me, literally and figuratively. One thing I found myself doing, I actually was running from my family, in the sense that, like, I didn't want to deal with Crystal, I didn't want to deal with the kids, and I would go into the bathroom with the light turned off and shut the door, and I would hide in a bathtub with no water in it. I would just hide in a dry bathtub with the curtain closed so that they couldn't find me, because I didn't want to deal with anybody. And I left it dark because I just wanted to be in the dark. And I felt really bad about that. I felt guilty about that. Well, you shouldn't isolate yourself. This is silly. Why are you doing this? And yeah, as I'm telling you, you're thinking that probably sounds really silly. You know, it is. It's really silly. But I trying to communicate the deep emotional pain that I was in to be in a state that would drive me to do that. I was talking to one of my mentors that I was really leaning on at the time, and I just told him I feel this desire to be alone. And I feel this desire to be alone and in the dark. And I told him, like, what I did. Like, I go to the bathtub and just like hide in the bathroom. And he told me what I wasn't expecting. I was expecting him to say, well, yeah, you shouldn't isolate yourself. That's really not good. You really need to, come around brothers and sisters and be encouraged and blah, blah, blah. That's what I was expecting him to say. But what he actually said was, so what? Basically, I mean, he said, you feel like you need to isolate yourself. Why don't you just isolate yourself? I'm thinking, and that's really weird. It's a really weird recommendation for you to give me, knowing what I'm going through. And didn't really know what to do with that. He just said, why don't you isolate yourself, and why don't you isolate yourself in the darkness, and why don't you look for Jesus there? And I hated him for saying that, because that was just a stupid thing to say. I mean, what does that even mean? It sounded like way too Christianese and spiritual to really mean anything like something that people, oh, you just look for Jesus there, and there was no substance to it. But this guy had already really significantly gained my trust, and he had already seen me through so much. And so I thought, well, okay, maybe he's got something there. I don't know what he's got, but maybe he's got something. And I left that just knowing, okay, look for Jesus in the darkness. That darkness, like I said, was physical. I physically wanted to be in a dark place, a literal dark place. But that was analogous to where I was in my season. I just felt, even when I wasn't actually physically, literally in the dark, I felt in the dark. I just felt alone and in the dark. There was a time that we go to a worship service, we did on Saturday nights, so that we could get fed and we wouldn't have to worry about the hubbub of Sunday morning. And we were going to this church. Crystal wasn't able to go this specific Saturday night, and I brought the kids, and I'm going, and I'm sitting in the parking lot just crying, not wanting to go inside because I don't want to be around anybody. And Zion in the back seat starts crying, let's go inside, I want to go inside. So we go inside. At one point, they sang a song, and I don't even remember the name of the song, but it talked about Jesus being alone in the dark tomb. And that's whenever it just kind of, it hit me. Jesus suffered what he suffered. And in suffering, in that suffering that he went through thousands of years ago, in that suffering, he relates to me in my suffering now. What he went through is nothing compared to what I went through. And he relates to me now in it, but he did that just so that he could now sit with me in this. In doing that, I have access to God even in this. Crystal said before that in the dark night, you just kind of feel like your prayers are just bouncing off the ceiling. And what gets you through the dark night is not some secret formula or secret prayer or secret realization to get your prayers to pierce through the ceiling and pierce through the roof and make it up to the heavens. What gets you through the dark night is realizing that your prayers don't have to go through the ceiling because Jesus is right there next to you. So your prayers don't have to reach the heavens. Your prayers can just literally just dribble off your lip, and Jesus is there catching them and holding them and saying, I've got you and I've got this. Realizing that was huge for me. And it wasn't like I walked out of the church and the clouds opened up and birds were singing, and I was still very much so in darkness. However, I realized I wasn't alone in the darkness anymore, and that Jesus was very much so present in that darkness with me. Psalm 23 has become one of my favorite songs. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I won't be afraid because I know that you're with me. And it was in that moment where I realized, okay, Jesus, you're here in this darkness. And it was the advice of my mentor. That's whenever it became real. Isolate yourself, and in that isolation, in that darkness, you realize that you're not really isolated, that Jesus is right there with you. That was really big. That began to get me through. That began to help me see some things. Jesus' presence with me in the darkness helped me realize that a lot of what I was wrestling with was really just stereotypical daddy issues. I was finding my identity in my dad, and my dad hurt a lot of people. My dad hurt me, and I was suppressing a lot of the characteristics that he had because I didn't want to be like him. However, my characteristics and my gifts and my strength are what make me me. That's what Father made me. That's how he's designed me and how he desires to use me. So I was suppressing a lot of that and pushing that down because I didn't want to be like my dad. And realizing that Jesus is with me, I realized that Jesus is there not just as an ornament, or not there just as a cool catchphrase to say that Jesus is with me in the darkness, but Jesus is there with a purpose, and that purpose is to sanctify me, right? That he died and he sent the Spirit dwells within me to sanctify me, to do something. And I realized that those gifts and those talents and those qualities and those characteristics that I have that are very much so like my dad, that he can use those and that he can redeem them and that he can utilize them for the advancement of his kingdom. And that was such a freeing thing for me. I mean, in the course of a week, here's what happened. I got a vision for Ferguson and for the people in my church and for the people in our community. I had a pastoral heart for the people in our church, something that I hadn't really had before. I didn't even really know what that was. I thought I had it, and there may be a level to which I don't even know exists that I'll find out later on that I haven't. But my pastoral heart and love for the people went to another level. I went from complaining about the church and about situations to defending the church almost overnight. And then I just felt this weight fall off of me that I didn't even realize how heavy it had gotten, where I just felt totally and completely free. And that's what I just kept telling Crystal, I'm free now. I'm free. I'm free to be who I am, and I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid of messing up because Jesus is here with me. Jesus has got me. And that mountaintop experience followed by that deep valley, and realizing that Jesus is with me in the darkest valley, Psalm 23, realizing that he's with me and he's coming up out of it with me. I mean, I would say I've almost surpassed the mountaintop that I was on already, and it's just been a short while. I mean, I feel so much, I feel more peace than what I had whenever I was on this mountaintop experience. I have more purpose than what I had whenever I was on that mountaintop. I mean, I am so excited about what Father is doing in our life. So I wanted to share that because whenever I'm on social media and I see that another pastor has decided to take his life, I see a response from other pastors, and I see a response from people in the church to where, and it's never said directly. It's never said directly. But there's almost this tone, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, and you guys can leave comments and let me know that I'm being silly. But there's almost this tone where there's some guilt laid on the people of the church. If only you would have loved your pastor more, because you'll see all these messages come out. Love your pastor, care for your pastor. Your pastor's really struggling with things. Your pastor carries so much weight. And just make sure that you communicate to them that you see them, and make sure that you're not so harsh to them whenever you criticize them. Criticism is important, but make sure you're not so harsh whenever you do it. And here's the thing: all of those are really good things to know and to understand. You're not supposed to be a jerk to your pastor. You shouldn't not be a jerk to your pastor because you're afraid that they're going to lose their life to suicide. You shouldn't not be a jerk to your pastor because you're afraid that they might be depressed and they might be wrestling with some things. You should not be a jerk to your pastor simply because you love your pastor, right? So I just want to make it super duper clear. One thing, even though I held up two fingers, it's a mirror. One thing, that there is no guilt that should ever be laid on a congregation or on a church because a pastor is wrestling with depression, or because a pastor has decided to has died at the hand of suicide. There should be no guilt that is laid on the congregation for that reason. The congregation is not to blame. And I also am not making the argument that the pastor is to blame. The enemy is to blame, right? And I wish I would see more conversations around that than capitalizing on moments where a pastor has lost their life, and capitalizing on those moments to try to guilt the congregation to be nicer to pastors. I wish I saw more conversations about how the enemy is the culprit. The enemy is the enemy, and that the answer is not for the congregation to be nicer to their pastor, or for the pastor to just get over his issues. But the answer it lies in the question of identity. So if you can do anything for your pastor, if you know that your pastor is wrestling with depression, I was very open in my sermons, and maybe you have a pastor that's kind of been open in his sermons. Maybe you've just kind of observed some things with your pastor. Maybe your pastor is just really killing it right now. Whatever the case is, instead of being nice to your pastor on the surface, which you should do, like you should be nice to your pastor because you love them. I really want to encourage everybody to begin right now praying for pastors. Pray for your pastor as he wrestles with the pastorate, as he wrestles with ministry, as he wrestles with all that he has going on, to instead of finding his identity in his position in ministry, or instead of finding his identity in a parent, or instead of finding his identity in some other pastor that's really killing it, instead of finding his identity in any of these things, instead just find his identity in Jesus and what that means, and figure out what that means for him.
While you're praying for your pastor, especially if you are aware that your pastor is going through depression, like I know some of the pastors who have lost their lives, they were very open about their struggle. Pray for their families as well, because it's terrifying and you feel very helpless. And while Kingston was going through that season, one pastor in particular took his life, and I just, I didn't know if I was gonna be in the news, me and my voice. And girl, Zoe was a newborn when it was the worst. So pray for the ministry family. With Kingston, he also struggled with anger during that season, and so I didn't know how to even address some of his negative behavior with me or with the kids, and he was so I don't want to be disrespectful, but he was very fragile. Is that okay to say? Mm-hmm. So I was afraid to say or do. It was very anxiety inducing, I think, for everyone in our home, because we never knew what would push him over the edge. And so if he could attack us, or he would mostly attack himself. He was very violent against himself, and that was very sad, and that was depressing, I think, for everyone, and scary for everyone. But now I agree that you said that, like, your spiritual life now, it's almost better than it was when you had that mountaintop experience. He's a different man now. His faith surprises me, and his character surprises me, and Christ is our rock. But I'm just very thankful that I can lean on him now, and he's strong, and I know his strength. It's not that he's perfect by any means. And it's not that he's never weak or scared or vulnerable, but I trust, because I saw him go through that, and I saw how he came out of it. It wasn't just a quick fix thing, or him placing his hope in something else that was shifting sand, because I know I saw him be with Jesus and still be in the depression, because the depression did not lift when he had the realization. I look at him and I see him being with Christ. I see him standing on solid ground, and he's the foundation that lays the foundation for our family. So now when I am struggling with my depression that I struggle with here and there, or my anxiety that's always there, I have him as a covering in a way that I did not have before. And I can look to him as my pastor in a way that I couldn't before, not because he struggled with depression, but because he wasn't with Jesus in the depression. Is that okay to say? Mm-hmm. So now I trust that even if he does have another season that the Lord allows of depression, I trust that he'll know how to be depressed in the throne room of God.
Pray for your pastors. Pray for them specifically that they find their identity and that they wrestle with their identity and what that means in Jesus. And by the way, I'm not at all saying that I figured out what that means. That's a journey. That's the name of our channel is Anchor and Abide. And so as we anchor ourselves in Jesus and what He's done for us, we abide in Him, and that's abiding in Him is a journey and is a process that we engage in our lives with Him that is wrestling with and discovering our identity in Him as we abide in Him. So pray for your pastors, pray for us. We've got a lot more to share about what we're doing, and we're not going to share that on this video. That's to come. But pray for us, pray for your pastors, and pray for yourself. Continue to wrestle with your own identity, and continue to figure out what that means to anchor yourself in Jesus and in His work, and abide in His everlasting, never-ending love. And just remember that He's not up there. Well, He is. He's up there, but He's not just up there. He's right here. He's with you. He's in you. He's in front of you, behind you. He's all around you. So seek to find Him because He's there.